Thank you all for joining, and I will now introduce today's presenter. Marcie has over 10 years of clinical research experience across multiple institutions, trial types, and funding sources. Prior to joining the University of Colorado Cancer Center as the DSM manager, her background included work as a clinical research coordinator, quality assurance manager, and director of operations at an NCorp. She has been with the DSMC since January of 2025. Thank you, Marcie, for being here with us this afternoon. I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Victoria, and thank you for having me, and thank you to everybody joining today. I hope to make this as not boring as possible for the topic of protocol deviations. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Also, a fun fact that today is actually my birthday. So thank you to everybody for celebrating with me today with this really exciting topic. Appreciate it. Hi, as Victoria mentioned, my name is Marcie Warren. I am the relatively new Data Safety Monitoring Manager. I've been here since January and have learned a lot in the past 7 months, and I'm excited to share some updates about the DSMC with you guys all. So today we will cover the introduction to the DSMC. We'll talk about the structure and function of the DSMC with our main content focusing on protocol deviations and unanticipated problems. We will touch briefly on serious adverse event reporting, and if we have time at the end of this, then we will talk about some 2025 DSMC audit trends that our auditors have seen so far this year. So first, I'd like to introduce our team. So the DSMC auditing team is overseen in its entirety by our Quality and Compliance Program Director, Sherry Wilkie. That is who I report to. And then I serve as the DSMC manager. And underneath me, we have three fabulous auditors. We have Josh Saginaw, Bonnie Wiseman, and Sarah Huff. Josh and Bonnie primarily focus on our IITs, and the two of them also manage our portfolio of oncology CAR-T therapy studies. And Sarah is our NCTM LAPS auditor, but since the grant doesn't cover 100% of her time, Sarah does also participate in auditing some IITs as well, because there are a lot of them, and just two, and not even really three, can get to all of them. So we are very happy and thankful to have the three of these very experienced auditors on our team. So when we talk about the DSMC, I do think it is important to note that there are, quote, two sides of the house. So the DSMC is comprised of the DSMC chair, who's Dr. Peter Cabos, as well as myself as the DSMC manager, our committee members, and the team of auditors. So the first side of the house is the actual DSMC members. So the members are independent clinical research experts, and these experts can be physicians, primarily medical oncologists. We do have statisticians, pharmacists, data safety management staff across various specializations. And we do really pride ourselves on trying to have a varied staff on the DSMC as far as our specializations. When we're reviewing certain study types, if you are reviewing a blood cancer study, it's nice to have the input from an actual hematologist, but it is also good to get input from a solid tumor physician because that input is valuable as well. The DSMC committee members do meet quarterly to review reported adverse events, our internal DSMC reports, audit reports, pharmacy safety trends, and safety reports. We meet January, April, July. Our July meeting is actually tomorrow, and October. And the DSMC members are also available for consultation if we were to want their input. Let's say if we had an unacceptable audit and we wanted to determine what the next course of action should be, we would reach out to all of those committee members. We can reach out to them and ask them to join at any time and to provide that feedback, but at minimum, we are meeting quarterly to review studies on a rotating basis. And then, as I mentioned already, the other side of the house is our actual auditors. So we have three auditors, two for interventional IITs, one for NCT and LAPS. And our auditors go in and perform routine audits, and they review these trials for deficiencies in 5 key areas. They focus on eligibility and consent, adherence to protocol, study treatment administration, quality of data collection, and regulatory study documentation. In writing their reports with their findings from an audit, our auditors will provide suggestions for determining root cause analysis or, as necessary, implementing corrective and preventive action plans. We don't want to simply leave you guys with findings of something that is wrong without some sort of course correction recommendations. Those audit reports also can sometimes require follow-up from teams where DSMC is actually following up with them. We need a response from teams to show that they have taken those corrective actions. So I do think it is important to mention, I have mentioned it a few times, IITs versus NCTN. And for those that may not be familiar with it, it is good to just put a reminder in here. So IITs are our investigator-initiated trials. These can be treatment trials, tissue bank trials, non-treatment interventional, or observational. And these are trials that initiate within the university system themselves with a investigator-initiated and written protocol. NCTN studies are NCI-funded trials from the National Clinical Trial Network. We look at lead academic performance sites, which is what we call LAPS, and the integrated components such as sites like Highlands Ranch and North and South. We also look at some of the LAPS affiliates, which would be Vail Health, the VA, and Denver Health. So these are the trial types that our auditors are auditing, but it is also important to note that we are talking today about protocol deviations and serious adverse events, and the DSMC and committee members and DSMC chair can review and do review SAEs and protocol deviations for all cancer center studies. So that would include industry-funded studies as well. We're just not auditing those. So now that we've talked about who the DSMC is, we can talk about what it is we do. The Data Safety Monitoring Committee is here to fulfill a requirement that is set by the NCI to uphold our comprehensive cancer center status. So in order for the University Cancer Center to be a comprehensive cancer center, we have to have an operating DSMC. The DSMC's role is to review data safety monitoring progress reports for our drug and device interventional IITs. Our auditors are conducting internal audits. We review SAEs, UAPs, and protocol deviations, and we're reviewing them for safety trends, and if we need to make recommendations for study conduct based on any of these events, then we can do so. We conduct protocol review, and this is done in conjunction with PRMS at study startup to determine the level of DSMC oversight that is needed. We also can help teams with external audit preparation. And for studies that have their own independent DSMB, we do supervise and provide oversight of those independent DSMBs. We ask these teams to submit those reports to us for review at our quarterly meeting or at otherwise determined intervals. This is kind of a self-indulgent slide a little bit, but it is an important thing to talk about the difference between auditing and monitoring. So we will get a lot of times where we have somebody who's very familiar with being monitored and maybe not as much familiar with being audited. And they are very similar, but they are two distinct and separate things. Monitoring is a continuous real-time process of observing and ensuring that a trial is in accordance with protocol, site SOPs, good clinical practice, and Code of Federal Regulations. Monitoring kind of happens on an interval basis, and you will have a monitor that is very familiar with your trial. They're actively working through corrective actions with you. They get very familiar with the subjects and with the study, and they are working in those things real time with a team. Whereas auditing is periodic, systematic, and independent. So auditing comes in and we look at a snapshot in time, and we can only look at so much. The analogy that we typically use when we talk about auditing versus monitoring is we are looking at the forest rather than the trees. A monitor is in there. They are definitely looking at all regulatory study documentation, patient data, and all of the same things that an auditor would look at, but they are able to look at each individual tree versus the auditors typically have to look at the whole forest, and we're looking at it from a very systematic and independent standpoint. When we say that we're looking at things from a snapshot in time, I think that's another important thing to note is that a lot of times an auditor will come in and we will be looking at patient data, and let's say an SAE went unreported, and that's a finding, and a team will share with us, well, we've made that protocol amendment at this point, that is no longer considered a reportable SAE. But if that is a protocol amendment that went into effect in March of 2025, and we are looking at a event that happened in December of 2024, you have to look at how it is operating from the protocol amendment that was active at the time. So it is still a finding because it was missing at that point in time. We are looking at things as they stood when it was happening, not necessarily as things stand now. And none of this is meant to be punitive. It is simply meant to be a way for teams to correct things that they may have missed previously. When we talk about how often we are auditing, that is really a risk-based approach. So I've put this table here, which the information does come directly from our data safety monitoring plan, which we'll chat about in a moment. And risk level of the trial really does guide how often it will be audited. So you would obviously think that the higher risk studies would probably need to be looked at a little bit more frequently when we're talking about patient safety. So extremely high risk studies are our cell and gene therapy studies, as well as any first in human IIT. These studies need to send progress reports to the DSMC to be reviewed at the quarterly meeting every 3 months. And we do pull monthly cumulative SAE and UAP reports that are reviewed by the DSMC chair. And it's our goal to audit these studies every 3 to 6 months. Of course, that's very hard with only 3 auditors and a lot of these very extremely high risk studies that have a lot going on and a lot of data. So it is our goal to make it there every 3 to 6 months, but sometimes things will fall out of that scheduling as far as we have availability. High-risk studies are any of the multi-center IITs as well as any IND or IDE IITs. Those send progress reports to us every 6 months, and those will typically be on either a January-July review cycle or an April-October review schedule. We are pulling those SAE and UAP reviews from Encore and a cumulative report quarterly versus monthly. So as the risk goes down, so does our review frequency. And we are auditing those trials as much as possible every 6 to 9 months. Moderate risk are any of our single center IND or IDE studies or any of our IND exempt IITs. We are looking at those either every 6 months, like the high risk, or every 12 months, depending on the actual trial setup. We are also reviewing those reports quarterly for SAEs and UAPs, and we are trying to audit those every 9 to 12 months. And as you can see there, we do have a caveat that we are always trying to make sure that we are current with higher risk trials before we get into auditing moderate or low risk studies. So if we have an extremely high risk first in human IIT that has put on 6 new patients and has not been audited in 4 months, we would probably have to go back in and audit that study before we would go and look at a moderate risk study that may be within the 12-month review cycle there. Low risk trials are any non-drug or device study interventions, tissue banks, correlative, ancillary studies. We do not require progress reports for these, and if there are ever any SAEs or UAPs, it's very rare, especially in tissue bank or observational correlative studies. But if they do occur, we will pull those reports and review them. And these are noted as subject to audit. So we are not trying to keep on a schedule. It would be very difficult to keep up with all of the low risk studies with 3 auditors, but they are subject to audit. And I do think it's important to note that our auditors we're trying to rework our scheduling process because we are finding that sometimes we have a low risk study that will put on 500 patients and never get audited. or by the time they do get audited, there's 550 subjects. We send an auditor in and they realize that they have consented every single patient incorrectly. It would have been a lot better if we could have got in with the first 20 subjects and identified that and fixed it for the remaining 530 rather than waiting until there's 500. So our auditors are trying to get better at slotting in some audits with high enrolling low risk studies because those deserve to be looked at just as much as any other trial. And if we can get to them sooner than later in the enrollment process, the better. So we've talked about the difference between monitoring and auditing. We've talked about how often we go in, but let's talk about what the role of auditing is. I have it mentioned again here that auditing is systematic and an independent quality assurance examination. We are independent, we are third party. We are simply here to point things out and to help you with course correction. This is not a punitive operation. Audits can either be routine, for cause, or requested. So most of our audits are routine. They are scheduled per the guidelines that we just talked about in the DSMP based on the risk of the trial. We can also do a for cause audit if there is reason to believe that there is an issue that needs to be addressed via an independent audit that can be put into place. And we can also do audits as requested. We have had teams that become aware of an upcoming sponsor audit, or maybe they have had interactions that lead them to believe the FDA may be coming to look at this study soon, and they've reached out to DSMC, even if they are not already being routinely audited by the DSMC, to say, hey, we could really use some audit readiness prep. Could you come in and audit us to let us know where we have deficiencies before the sponsor audit or the FDA or whatever kind of audit it is coming? And we are always happy to do that. Audits provide teams with FDA inspection readiness, and they ensure integrity, reliability, and compliance of clinical trials. They're not meant to be scary. They are meant to be a useful tool. I promise all three of our auditors are extremely friendly. None of them bite, and we're always happy to help you guys. I have mentioned it a few times, so I do want to make sure everybody is aware of what our Institutional Data Safety Monitoring Plan, or our DSMP, is. The University Cancer Center DSMP covers institutional oversight of clinical trials, the protocol-specific monitoring and oversight, AE reporting and compliance, conflict of interest, and specifics about reporting information process flow. It's kind of our Bible. It's what we go off of as far as what our oversight is. When we're reviewing a study with PRMS, we lean heavily on it to make sure that the right language is included in a protocol and that we have the right oversight included in this. But it is available for anyone to review. So if you check out the DSMC's website, and I put a link here, and we can provide that to anybody who needs it as well. There is a link to our DSMP. It is in the process of being edited. It gets edited every few years, so we make changes as we see fit. So it is a year for edits happening, so it will be a new one in the coming months, but it is available for anybody that wants to review it. Also, a note about DSMP. There can be a protocol-specific DSMP as well, so a protocol can include their own data safety monitoring plan that covers how they will handle monitoring, how they will handle data safety review, SAE reporting, all of that good stuff. It can also include stopping rules. So a protocol can have their own DSMP, but there can also be an institutional DSMP as well. Okay, so now we will talk about protocol deviations. So first and foremost, what is a protocol deviation? It's kind of right there in the name, but a protocol deviation occurs when, without significant consequence, activities on a study diverge from the institutional review board approved protocol. So what is an example of a protocol deviation? You could have a lab sample that is missed, and a lab sample can be missed for any number of reasons. Maybe a blood sample was clotted because the cap was left off of the collection tube. Maybe it was a really difficult blood draw and there was an insufficient sample size. Maybe you spilled a urine sample. Maybe it was improperly collected because the wrong needle type was used. You could have a patient that was not fasting and you needed a fasting plasma glucose. Any number of unintentional deviations can happen that would lead to something like a lab sample being missed. And it's generally unplanned, and it is an excursion from the protocol. So even though it was unplanned, even if it was unavoidable, it was a simple mistake. If you do not have a lab sample that is specified in the protocol as being collected at this point in time, it was not collected, you have now deviated from your protocol. So it's unplanned excursion that is not implemented or intended as a systematic change. You do not want to be seeing this frequently. It's a mistake. It happens. And it can also refer to an unplanned instance of protocol noncompliance. Protocol deviations do differ from a protocol violation, though. So protocol violations are deviations as well, but these are ones that reduce quality and completeness of data, impact a subject's safety, rights, or welfare, or affect the scientific integrity of a protocol. In general, a protocol deviation or protocol violation is more serious than a protocol deviation, and it requires more specific attention. It can also indicate maybe intentional deviation from the protocol with intent to harm. So we really do not want to see any protocol violations, but protocol deviations are a fact of life. They do happen. And part of this presentation is to help us learn how to avoid them whenever possible. So protocol deviations, let's talk about their IRB reportability. I have a disclaimer here that all protocol deviations are reportable. Anytime you become aware of a deviation from the protocol, you do have to report that and that it is documented. Not all deviations are IRB reportable. So protocol violations, UAPs, protocol deviations that may have an effect on patient safety, those are promptly reportable to an IRB. But you can have a lot of minor protocol deviations like those missing lab samples that do need to be recorded. You need to have somewhere that it mentions this was a deviation from the protocol, the PI has assessed this for safety, and we have determined it is reportable to the IRB or it is not reportable to the IRB. It's not just simply you notice it and then you move on. All protocol deviations are reportable, but only some make it to the criteria of reportable to the IRB. So I have included the guidelines for the two most common IRBs that our studies here in the Cancer Center are utilizing, and that is WRB or WCG and COMRB. So with a WRB managed study, the policy is to report any of the following within 5 calendar days. So new or increased risk to a patient, protocol deviation that harmed the subject actively, so not just increased risk, but actively did harm the patient or placed them at risk of harm, and protocol deviations made without prior IRB approval to eliminate immediate hazard to a subject. COMRB is very similar. An event is significant and therefore reportable if there has been investigator noncompliance that presents potential risk to subjects. Another event that signals previously unrecognized or unconsidered potential risk to subjects, or an ineligible subject is enrolled without sponsor approval. Cancer is a very fickle thing, and sometimes we do enroll ineligible subjects for a very good reason, but those do have to be approved ahead of time by the sponsor. And I do have an asterisk there as a note. For an IIT, the sponsor may be a drug manufacturer, but if the investigator themselves holds the IND, the PI of the study is acting as the sponsor and is the one that can give that sponsor approval, but it does need to be approved by the IRB as well. So when we were talking about the DSMC, I've mentioned already that protocol deviations are reported to the DSMC, so let's talk about how that happens. So our University Cancer Center Encore work instructions do mention that protocol deviations are to be entered into Encore. That protocol deviation report, I run that monthly and send it to the DSMC chair for review. So as you can imagine, a monthly report of every protocol deviation that happens on every study in the Cancer Center is pretty hefty. So I run this monthly, I review it myself and try to pick out the most significant ones that need to be brought to the top of the list for review by the DSMC chair, those that affect patient safety, in my opinion. He reviews those, then also reviews the entire report himself. And if further action is required or we would like to request more information on any of those, then we would reach out to the team at that point. Please do note that your studies may not be requiring protocol deviations to be entered into Encore. If that is the case, then that is okay. We would maybe not be seeing your protocol deviations, but please check with your teams and please check with the University Cancer Center work instructions to see if your team should be entering them into Encore, because that is the best place to capture these and run our cumulative reports. Even if you're not entering them into Encore, you should be utilizing a protocol deviation log. So as we mentioned, they are all reportable and that they all need to be documented and show PI oversight. So if you're not entering them into Encore, please do keep a comprehensive real-time log that notes every time there's a protocol deviation and that it was assessed for safety and IRB reportability in real time as soon as you're made aware. There are on-course role-based guidelines that you can find on the Cancer Center intranet and the Encore resources that has a guide for clinical research coordinators of how to enter protocol deviations into Encore. We can also find protocol deviations via auditing and also monitoring. So as wonderful as all of these teams and clinical research coordinators and data managers and PIs and sub-Is are, sometimes things do slip through the cracks and you're not aware of a protocol deviation until an auditor or a monitor gets in there and finds it. So protocol deviations can also be reported to the DSMC if one of our auditors finds them and reports it via their audit findings. Findings that are protocol deviations would fall under the category I discussed earlier, one of our big five, which is protocol adherence. And those findings can either be major or minor. And if it is a major finding, it may require a CAPA or corrective action plan to show how you are going to fix and avoid those problems in the future. So we've talked about the need to report them, but let's talk about why it's important. Nobody likes telling on themselves. Nobody likes to point out when they have done something wrong, but it is very important to accurately and thoroughly report all protocol deviations, violations, and UAPs. So deviations from the study protocol may place participants at risk and compromise the scientific validity of the research, which is the whole reason that we're doing this. So it is very important to report them so that they can be reviewed and course correction can be put into place if necessary. Also, if a protocol deviation affects patient safety, it may need to be acted on quickly to avoid further potential harm to that patient. We know we want to protect other patients in the future from the same potential risk of increased harm. But if you have a patient that's actively being harmed, like let's say the protocol deviation that's discovered as a patient is getting double dosed, we need to be aware of that as soon as possible so that we can say we stop double dosing them and do we need to do any other supportive measures to help the harm that has already happened to that patient. If we notice trends with consistent, persistent, or repeated protocol deviations, this is when it will lead to a root cause analysis and a corrective action plan. So if you are seeing that a lab sample is missed at every single patient visit for every single patient, this isn't just a, oops, we missed the lab. This is a consistent, persistent problem, and we need to figure out why. We need to do root cause analysis to determine why, and the team needs to show a corrective action plan to show how they're not going to make the same mistake in the future. But it does happen where if something is persistent enough, a team is unable to correct it, and this may need to be a protocol amendment. So an example of this that I have encountered in my real lifetime working in research, we had a protocol that stated an infusion should be given over 30 minutes with a plus or minus 10-minute window. So it should be given in no more than 40 minutes. It should have been started at 33 milliliters an hour, titrating up to 50 milliliters an hour as the patient tolerates it. But when the auditing team came in, they noticed that there were persistent protocol deviations for infusions over 40 minutes. Out of the 10 subjects, I think 9 of them had an infusion over 40 minutes. So now we have a persistent, continuing problem. Let's do a root cause analysis. Root cause analysis was performed and determined that the actual volume of IP that was being infused, if the infusion rate never went above the 33 milliliters an hour to that titration up to 50, you can't feasibly administer all of the medication within 40 minutes. And a lot of the patients were actually having a tougher time tolerating 50 milliliters. So per protocol, it's okay to infuse at 33 milliliters an hour, but then that was leading to consistent protocol deviations because it could not be completed within 40 minutes. Wasn't something that they anticipated happening when writing the protocol, but we were just never going to be able to avoid protocol deviations like that with the patients we knew we had unable to tolerate over 33 milliliters an hour. So a protocol amendment did have to be put into place to ensure that those protocol deviations would not continue. Another interesting thing of note with this same situation, the root cause analysis also found that the infusion nurses included the time it took to flush the line after the infusion was completed in the infusion time. Even though it was only 2 to 3 minutes, if you had a 39-minute infusion and then you also included the 2 or 3 minutes it took to flush the line after that, now you have a protocol deviation that actually didn't really need to be in place. So re-education was provided to the infusion nurses to say you start the infusion time from the time the medicine starts dripping until the medicine stops, and the line flushing is not included in that time. So that also helped cut down on some of the deviations that were there that may not have actually been a deviation. So root cause analysis can be really important in discovering things such as this. So let's talk about what we should not do with protocol deviations. A kind of a hot button issue is the term a planned deviation. Some IRBs do actually approve of planned deviations because you can be made aware of things ahead of time that you know will deviate from the protocol, and you get approval of that ahead of it happening. But all attempts should be made to not plan a deviation in advance, especially if it will affect patient safety or eligibility. Life happens, human nature happens, so we are aware that there are times when you will be made aware in advance of something and be unable to change it, but you don't want to take a subject off of study, so you know a planned deviation will happen. You discuss with the sponsor, you discuss with the IRB, and it happens. We try to avoid them. We can't always. Bringing in two more real world examples of things I've seen in my time in research. Two examples of times when you may be planning for a deviation. One of these instances is something that may be okay, and another is one that is not as okay. So first example, I used to work with pediatric patients, and we had a prospective patient on a pediatric trial. You needed to be 10 to participate. This patient was 9. They would not turn 10 until September, but it was a really fast and furious study, 4 weeks, 2 visits a week, with long infusions. And patient or the family of the patient said, well, that's really a lot of time away from school, so it would be better if we could just have them enrolled in the summer. Let's just go ahead and enroll them in June, even though they're not 10 yet, and just take the deviation. We definitely cannot do something like that unless the investigator were to determine that the patient is so sick that they needed this treatment really ahead of time. Then that could be a different situation that is discussed in depth with the IRB ahead of time. But just for convenience sake, we are not going to enroll an ineligible subject in this manner. Another example is maybe a patient who's actively on a cancer trial, and he comes and tells the study team that his daughter is now getting married out of the country in 6 months. We plot out the dates and determine that that visit will actually be at the same time that his cycle 13 infusion needs to happen. So that visit will have to be completed out of window. This is an instance where if this is a patient that's very stable, he's doing really well on treatment, we're aware this many months in advance that we can plan for a deviation as this. We're not going to give him the two options of go off trial or don't go to your daughter's wedding for something like this. But for this example, it's really important to work very actively with your PI, with your treatment team, to determine the best course of action for deviating in this way. Is it better to skip that cycle and make it up on the back end? Should this visit happen early? Should it happen late? Making sure that any subsequent visits are not based off of the new window of this deviated window, all sorts of things. Is it best to call the patient during that time, even though they're in Italy for this wedding, and check in with them and make sure that they're not having any ill effects? All of these things should be taken into consideration and planned ahead for. Planned deviations do need to be confirmed with the study sponsor and IRB if applicable and necessary in advance. As soon as you're aware of it, no matter how minor it seems, do not just plan to take the deviation. It should always be discussed very thoroughly before it happens. Another thing not to do with a protocol deviation, please don't just write a note to file and explain a situation and say that you've reported a protocol deviation. Note to files can sometimes be helpful in explaining circumstances around something that happened, but it is not taking the place of accurately reporting a deviation either in Encore on your protocol deviation log or reporting to the IRB. Also, a note, if there is some CCTO guidance out there that says that if a protocol deviation, if there is any documentation that already exists, whether that is an IRB submission or it's on a deviation log, you should not also write a note to file. So again, extra documentation, emails surrounding conversations that have happened are very useful, but it cannot take the place of actual reporting. Alrighty, so speaking of protocol deviations and violations, let's talk about unanticipated problems. In general, for a COMRB managed trial, events that are considered major deviations and therefore reportable and/or a protocol violation are reported as unanticipated problems. So a UAP is a significant event that occurs during the course of a study that needs to be promptly communicated to COMRB. They need to be reported using the UAP report form. And this form actually does provide you with feedback about whether or not the event needs to be reported to COMRB promptly. That promptly usually is within 5 days. Sometimes you can have a protocol deviation or a UAP that does need reporting to the IRB, but it's not promptly, so you can just submit them all with continuing review. And sometimes it doesn't need to be reported at all. IRBs get way more papers and things to review than they could ever want. So sometimes they will help you determine that, nope, this actually doesn't need to be reported to us either promptly or at continuing review. This form looks just like this. This is a screenshot of the actual report form. So you have all of your study information there at the top. It tells you how to use the form. You click if it is a VA study, if it's an initial report or a follow-up report, and then you choose the most appropriate category for the event that you're reporting. Depending on which category you select, it will pre-populate new questions for you to start answering, and this form does help guide you towards whether or not it is reportable. The takeaway here is if you think it's probably reportable or it may even potentially be reportable, just pull up the form and start filling it out, see if you can get some feedback, or even reach out to a COMRB representative and see if you can ask some more questions. It is better to ask first and not have to report than it is to assume you don't need to, and then it turns out it was reportable and you missed it. This form can be found on the COMRB home website. You can actually just Google COMRB UAP form and it'll help guide you there, but their forms are all available on their website. So we've talked about a few examples of protocol deviations, some more serious, some less serious. So let's talk about an example of a UAP. So this is actually an example of a UAP that was discovered during an audit. It had not previously been reported, so it was a major finding on the audit report about this UAP. So the first bullet here is how a finding would be written in an audit report. Our auditors will actually cite the source of where this is deviating from. So this is deviating from Encore Use Requirements SOP and the DSMP that a UAP occurred on study and was not reported. So now this is a violation. So this was a very interesting case where it was an angiosarcoma study. And the inclusion, number 5, was that a subject had to have one of the following histologies related to angiosarcoma. And retrospectively, a patient no longer met that criteria. So these were patients that were not eligible for surgery, and they would go onto this treatment trial. But at some point during the subject's treatment, I believe the case was re-reviewed by another surgical board and determined that the patient was eligible for surgery. Patient had successful surgery, and with the additional pathology that they received from that surgery, it was determined that the initial pathology report was incorrect. The patient did not have angiosarcoma, and no further treatment was required. So the good news is the study did do some due diligence with taking the subject off of treatment, saying, oh, okay, we understand that now you no longer have the necessary diagnosis to participate, but that patient was in violation of the protocol for the time they were on treatment, and that was unreported. The PI was made aware, and the UAP wasn't reported. It was discussed with the auditor and with our team during the exit interview. The team was very willing to go ahead and submit this UAP, and were re-educated on the importance of, as soon as you're made aware of something as serious as this, it should be reported right away. I would be remiss as the data safety monitoring manager if I did not talk about SAEs, even though UAPs and protocol deviations are more important part of this presentation. I would like to talk on serious adverse event reporting as well. So what constitutes a serious adverse event? So per 21 CFR 312, an SAE is a death, a life-threatening adverse event, inpatient hospitalization or a prolongation of an existing hospitalization, a persistent or significant incapacity or a substantial disruption to the ability of a patient to conduct normal life functions, or a congenital anomaly or birth defect that occurs from a patient on a study. This is the main bones of what would constitute an SAE, but at any important medical event that may not result in death, be life-threatening, require hospitalization, can be considered serious when, based upon appropriate medical judgment, they may jeopardize the patient or subject and require medical or surgical intervention to prevent one of the outcomes listed in this definition. So if you are just browsing this and there is a pretty serious event or something that seems significant that happens and it doesn't meet one of those 5 criteria, it is still a good idea to go ahead and discuss this with your investigator and to really research your protocol in depth to see if it still meets reporting serious adverse event reporting criteria. So some examples of other reportable adverse events, potentially a death that is unrelated to study treatment, but it occurs within 30 days of the last study treatment. You could have a patient that passes in a car accident, but they just finished the study 3 days ago. So we think that it's unrelated, but it's reportable because we need to verify that it is not related. Maybe they were unable to fight off those life-threatening injuries from a car accident because of their participation, so it should still be reported. Death that can be considered at least possibly related to study treatment at any time point. So we have a lot of deaths from progressive disease, but if there is any indication that it could be at least possibly related to study treatment at any time point, it should still be reported promptly. Secondary malignancies, we hate to see, but if those do occur, those should be promptly reported. An unplanned pregnancy or any pregnancy that does happen that should not have happened while the patient was on study, especially if consent indicates that female subjects should not become pregnant while on study, should be promptly reported, as well as any untoward event towards a fetus or an unborn child. So we report SAEs to the IRB. Study teams should be aware of how to do this, and it's something that is outlined in your study protocol with your sponsor and with your IRB of record, but SAEs do get reported to the DSMC as well. So let's talk about reporting SAEs to the DSMC. First step is that your study participant reports or the study staff identifies an SAE, UAP, or an other reportable event during a trial. You need to complete all initial report forms and documentation required by the protocol. You submit those initial report forms as required, and then you should follow the ENCORE guidelines to enter this SAE into ENCORE. If your trial is not utilizing ENCORE, then it should be emailed to our group DSMC inbox. But if you are using ENCORE, you don't also have to email. That's been a little source of confusion as ENCORE has been rolled out amongst more teams over the past few years because a lot of teams were used to emailing it to us. If it is in ENCORE, we will see it. You do not need to also email it to us. You can always shoot us a message and ask, do you see this in ENCORE? Do you want us to email it? We're always happy to answer those questions. But as long as it's in ENCORE, we will see it. And when you are entering it ENCORE, please ensure that the entry is complete. We understand that if you're doing something promptly, you may not have all of the information at that point, and you may have to put in an incomplete entry just to get it in within the designated timeline. That's okay, but do be aware that the DSMC will reach out with requests for follow-up or additional information if we don't see it within a few days. Otherwise, if you do not hear anything from us, no other communication is typically generated from the DSMC mailbox. Just know that we are reviewing it. We are pulling these weekly and reviewing at the very least the grade 5s with our DSMC chair, Dr. Cabos. If the SAE, UAP, or other reportable AE does require subsequent follow-up reporting, you would repeat steps 1 through 5 until the event has resolved and all the reporting follow-up has been completed. And then very, very importantly, you file all of the documentation of anything that you have done surrounding that SAE in the patient chart so that it is made available to any monitor, auditor, or reviewer. So when we are talking about reporting and reporting timelines, what if your protocol has its own SAE definitions and reporting timelines? So this happens very frequently where our DSMP has one timeline, your protocol has another timeline, and the IRB of record has a different timeline. The protocol says this needs to be reported in 24 hours. Your IRB says within 3 days, and the DSMP says 7 days. So what do you follow if there are multiple reporting timelines? If in doubt, follow the shortest timeline. If something to any of the entities that require reporting to require something within 24 hours, our recommendation is to just report it to all entities within 24 hours because then you've met everybody else's longer timelines. It's not good practice to say, well, I've submitted this within 24 hours to the IRB, but we're still waiting on the last few lab reports, and I have 5 more days until DSMC needs to be made aware of it. I'm going to just wait. Chances are then you miss the entire timeline because you get very busy and forget. So if you have different timelines, always defer to the shortest one and try to submit everything at the same time. So if a protocol requires reporting of an event, then the DSMC needs to review it. So if it is a reportable event, it is reportable to your sponsor, to your IRB, and the DSMC. Again, it is reportable via Encore. That is where it should be submitted, and that is where we will see it. If your protocol does not require the reporting of an event, we may not need to review it. So there could be instances, this is an example from one of our active CAR-T protocols, that after the dose-limiting toxicity safety period, only AEs and SAEs that are treatment-related require reporting. So any other AEs or SAEs that are not related to treatment during this time period do not need to be reported. So if your protocol states that, then DSMC may not need to be made aware. Again, make sure that you are up to speed with all of the reporting requirements for IRB, sponsor, protocol, and DSMC before assuming that it doesn't need to. If in doubt, just contact us and ask about reporting rather than not reporting something or reporting late. And then we talked about multiple reporting timelines already. All right, so last thing I will finish up with, just because I do think it is interesting and it is useful to give a picture of how things are happening actively within studies, is some audit trends that we've seen in the year to date from the audits that have happened. So our 3 auditors have been very busy. Our IITs, they've completed 16, 8 with satisfactory results, 6 with acceptable that require follow-up. No unacceptable IITs thus far, but we do have 2 that are still pending final report. There have been 10 NCTN lap studies that have occurred, 6 with acceptable requiring follow-up, 3 satisfactory, and 1 that is still pending a final report. And of the CAR-Ts, just because they are kind of a whole different beast, I pulled those out separately. 4 of those audits have occurred, 2 with an acceptable requiring follow-up result, 1 unacceptable, and 1 that is still pending final report. Of our NCTN lap studies, I broke it out into those 5 categories that we've talked about: eligibility, adherence to protocol, study treatment administration, data collection, and regulatory. Blue is major findings and orange is minor findings. So overall, as we'd like to see more minor findings than major findings. And you can see that some categories have a tendency to have more major findings than others. But what we like to see is in NCTN studies, there were no major adherence to protocol or protocol deviation findings. Versus, unfortunately, when we look at our IITs, there were 5 major adherence to protocol findings, no minor. So every single finding in this category was considered a major finding. So that is kind of something that we would like to flip that. And if we are seeing findings in this category, we're seeing more minor than major. So it's just something to be aware of. As you can see, data collection and regulatory study documentation, we usually have a lot of findings because there's a lot of moving parts within those. but what we like to see mostly major or mostly minor with only a few major. Study treatment administration and documentation, again, leaning a little more heavily on major than minor, but these are the things that affect the patient's actual conduct on study. So if we see a problem with it, it does tend to lend itself a little more to a major finding. And eligibility and consent, all minor in that category as well. So for the category of regulatory, we see a lot of inadequate documentation of protocol training, especially if you have a bunch of amendments. We do please beg of you, please keep on top of your protocol training with your staff. There was also a lot of missing or incomplete training records. Sometimes the training happened and the records just weren't filed. Data collection, we always want to make sure that all of our data is Alcoa compliant, attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, accurate, and complete. So you'll see here in this example that there were AEs that were not recorded in the EDC. There was an EPIC source documentation did not match with the paper source documentation, or there were AEs that were not fully captured or recorded in EPIC that were on the EDC or source documentation. Terms, grades, dates, assessments are not fully documented. A lot of stuff where you're starting documentation and maybe don't finish it. So here's that adherence to protocol category. Again, this is of our IITs. Every single finding we had in this category was a major, so we do think it's important to talk about. So that UAP that we talked about earlier was one of our major findings in the adherence to protocol section, but another example of this is an unreported SAE. So for a subject on this study, an initial SAE was submitted for grade 3 progressive disease. And then a follow-up report was submitted about a month later that also still called the event a grade 3 progressive disease, but in the comments it said that the subject did pass away. So this on-study death is actually now a grade 5 death. So you have an unreported grade 5 event because you updated this grade 3 event and did not capture that. So you need to make sure that you are keeping up with things because that can happen very frequently where you have one event that starts as a lesser grade SAE that may end up as a grade 5 death that needs to be reported separately as such. This is a reminder that all SAEs should be reported to the DSMC unless caveat that your protocol states that it does not need to be reported. They should be entered into Encore. They are reviewed weekly. We do not require email notification as well, but if you are concerned that we are not seeing it, you can reach out to us and ask. For eligibility and consent findings, we do have a lot of little things with this where sometimes your consent process note will be done on a different date. Consent process note is maybe incomplete. So if a subject is consented on August 8th and then the process note is not done until August 15th, that's a problem. It needs to be done contemporaneously, especially because the subject had already begun treatment by the time the process note was in place. And study treatment, administration, and documentation. Again, this is one that tends to lend itself to more major findings, but an example of a finding here was there was non-compliance observed in the administration documentation of investigational treatment. So for one of the subjects, the IP was cladribine and it was administered over 25 minutes, but the protocol states it should be given over 2 hours. And there was no documentation to suggest why it was given that fast. So that would be an example of a major finding. Another example of this is that it was a study utilizing venetoclax, which is an oral medication, and this study actually used, it was just provided standard of care. Patients got it through their normal pharmacy, and they did not have any sort of compliance. It was a misunderstanding with the team that you did not need to collect compliance for drugs that are administered standard of care. If it is one of your drugs that lends itself to protocol outcomes, then you do need to have a drug diary of some sort in place. So that was a finding that we put as well as a CAPA, and that CAPA did include the study team having to show us what they would do as far as compliance documentation moving forward. So that is all I have. Thank you so much. You can contact the DSMC anytime with questions. You can reach out to me directly at my email. If you can find me on Teams, I'm also happy to answer a chat on Teams as well if you have any questions. We have the dsmc@cuanschutz.edu email inbox, and that is always monitored because myself, The auditors and Sherry Wilkie all have access to that. So even if somebody is out of town, it will be monitored. So that's the quickest way to get a response. And if you have a question for the DSMC chair, Dr. Cabos, that is also the best way to reach out because we have a direct line to him. He's got a very busy clinic schedule. So if you were trying to get to him, sometimes that is the fastest way to reach out to him as well. So that is all I have. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks, Marcie, for a wonderful presentation. I really loved your examples. I felt like they were very practical, and I like that you used some real examples that you've seen in your experience as well. We do have just a few minutes for questions, so if you have any questions, feel free to place one in the chat or unmute. We'll start with one that was submitted ahead of time. So as the DSMC continues to work with other cancer center units, Oakcrest and CCTO, how do you ensure successful communications and collaborations with study teams?
Sorry, it was not letting me unmute myself there. Thank you for the question. So communication is always an ongoing struggle, and it's something that we are very committed to doing effectively. So as I mentioned, trying to utilize our group email inbox for questions is one of the fastest way to ensure that communication and collaboration happens really quickly. I think we also all need to be aware that every team has a different functioning structure. So please be patient with DSMC. If we're not aware that your structure, Oakcrest utilizes program managers and other departments don't utilize program managers. So if I email somebody and they're like, well, you should have emailed the project manager, we may not be aware. So trying to just have a little bit of grace with us when it comes to communication. We are trying to make note of everybody's preferences so that we can get that collaboration and communication out appropriately ahead of time. But with that, we just ask that you guys understand that we are trying to spread our net across every single department within the Cancer Center, and everybody does it a little differently. We want to be collaborative with all of you, but we have limited time and limited resources to do so. But we also, if it can make your life easier, we want to do it. So please inform us, and as much as possible, we will try to implement that into our processes. And hopefully that answers that question.
Great, thank you, Marcie. And I know that we're close to end of time, but so I do want to be respectful of others' times. We did have a few additional questions come through. So Marcie, if you're available to stay on a few extra minutes,
Yeah.
we would love to answer those questions. But for everyone else who has to hop to another meeting, thank you for coming. And we hope to see you in just a couple of weeks for Sherry Wilkie's rescheduled presentation on FDA audits. But to read off some of these other questions. Marcie, do the auditors audit subsites that participate in IITs, for example, like in other states?
Yes. So if they are subject to auditing, which is determined, as I mentioned, in that PRMS review process when a study goes through study startup. So if we act as the lead academic site and our PI is the main PI of the study, those sites may be subject to audit. We did actually have one of those earlier this year with a site in Pennsylvania and California maybe, that we will audit those as well. So they can be, but not always. If we are just one of the multi-sites participating and another site acts as the lead, we will not be auditing those, but we may audit our own.
Excellent. And I just see one other question in the chat. What are your or are your criteria for what constitutes a major or minor finding in the DSMP? And we met a few weeks ago, actually, Marcie, and I loved the example that you gave on what constitutes a major or minor finding. So
Yeah.
if you could share about that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So in general, no, we try not to have a black and white definition of what something will be minor versus major. We do try to use a little bit of nuance with this. So we start with kind of a framework of, in general, if you have a minor data finding where you were putting in your EDC weight in kilograms instead of pounds, but the protocol says it should have been in pounds. If we see one instance of that, that's super minor and that's not going to have an effect on something. If we see 5 or more, then that starts to trigger us into, okay, does this now constitute a major finding? So once we hit something that may seem minor and it hits maybe 5 or more instances, that starts our thought process. But again, pounds versus kilograms, maybe not an effect on patient safety. But if you were incorrectly calculating ejection fraction and now you have 5 instances of that, that could be a major finding because the protocol may actually have ejection fraction as one of the exclusion criteria. So hopefully that makes sense there. We try to have, we don't really have a framework in the DSMP of this will be a major, this will be a minor. We also send all of our audit reports through a very intense peer review process. So one auditor goes out, audits, and then brings back their report to our entire team. We all review it and we discuss each of those findings in detail, and we get everybody's opinions and everybody's insight from other audits or experiences that they have to help us determine whether or not it should go in a major or a minor category. And I don't exactly remember which exact example I gave you when we talked a few weeks ago, Victoria, so I apologize if that was not the same one.
No, I think you hit on it. So thank you. Excellent. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat. Thanks to everyone who stayed on. If you
I saw one other thing that Josh did put in the chat, one of our auditors, when we were talking about communication, he did bring up a really good point. We rely really heavily on the Encore staff list for those communications. So Encore, where we go for our source of truth for most things. So as long as you have a very up-to-date, active Encore staff list of who needs to be, is usually where we start. So make sure that's somebody who wants to be primarily contacted, and we should be able to communicate with you guys pretty easily there.